Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast. My name is Sam Cooper and I'll be your host to guide you through everything you need to know about the McLaren F1 team. It's a huge week in the world of F1 as McLaren lift the covers on the MCL 38. Joining me to discuss all that is F1 content creator and head of content at Quadrant, Matt Ams, as well as Formula Nerds editor Sam Coop. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast. Joining me now, as promised, is Matt and Sam. First of all, how are you guys, Matt? How's your pre-season been? Has it been a busy one?
It's been insanely busy. I don't think we've ever had a pre-season like this where, like, just before we started recording, I don't think there is anything left that could, like, surprise us now. Like, Sam, you were mentioning before, like, when we finished off the season, we were thinking Andretti was going to be the big story of pre-season, but literally everything you could imagine has happened. So I can't think there's any new surprises. So now going into the car launches, it's been a little bit kind of dull because of all the big hype that we've had. So yeah, pre-season for me has been absolutely insane. What about you, Sam?
Yeah, I'm already tired. A combination of a short off season and then it's just been one thing after another. And you're right, livery season maybe a little bit dull, not necessarily all down to exposed carbon, but yeah, it's been a lot. So it's interesting to see how things will develop from here.
Yeah, I think dull's the right question when it comes to liveries. I mean, like you said, like you hinted towards it there, but the amount of exposed carbon that we've seen, I mean, particularly in my opinion, the Alpine was such a bad offender for that. I mean, it was all black. I mean, I was lucky enough to be there when it was launched, and I was like, oh no. And then you saw the pink version; it was barely even more pink, and you're like,
man.
Not a great year for car liveries.
Yeah, I think especially with that. Already. Yeah.
You've got a hot take.
Yeah, wow. my biggest thing with the Alpine one, obviously, we'll speak more obviously on McLaren, but so we're quickly touching this one. I think the biggest frustration from me was that they baited us with the pink carbon front wing, and everyone could look at that. Obviously, it was a very low render because of the edges were like very jagged and what have you. But it was like that was basically what the design we were expecting to be, like either all fully blue or pink camo. And then when it came out with that, it's just like, well, that's just not even true. I've literally just baited everyone to watch this live stream. And obviously we're looking at all the different cars first. So it's a bit like, oh, here's what you could have had instead. But no, now here's your version. And with all the drivers just sitting awkwardly by the front row, just not looking impressed.
Yeah, it reminds me, just what it reminds you of. It reminds me of McLaren and the Chrome livery last year, because they did exactly the same. They changed all their social media stuff all to Chrome. So you're thinking, oh wow, it's going to be proper Chrome. And then we got the car. I mean, it was a nice looking car. It could have been much better, but set the expectations low. That's what you've got to do. And then it'd be like, use Ferrari's example. Like they were like, it might have some yellow on it, and that was all we needed. And we were like, yes. And when it did have yellow on it, you felt happy. I'm going to ask Sam, what's your hot take?
I really like it.
Well, the Alpine.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
God.
Too late to end the show now.
That is a hot take.
Yeah.
Exposed carbon aside, I think if you take that whole issue, and it is an issue, I wouldn't be surprised that at some point F1 mandates a minimum paint requirement.
Yeah.
But I think objectively, it's really, really beautiful. In my view, I think, Matt, you're absolutely right that they shouldn't.
They lied to us, though, Samuel. They lied.
I know. And that is going to leave a bit of taste in the mouth. But it's interesting how I think the early adopters, say Mercedes last year, haven't been held to the same standards as Alpine have, or even Stake. Their car is very carbon heavy.
Yeah,
but I think you're right that kind of differentiating factor is that they led us down a path of, and also they haven't fallen into that trap as much as other teams over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting though, but I think, if I take a step back, I really like how it looks. I will say that it does look obviously like stickers as opposed to paint.
100%.
That's the issue.
Yeah, 100%.
But if you're going to do it. And they've fully leaned into it.
I think you've really said it perfectly there. It looks like a model kit, and you've just started the final stages of putting all the stickers on, and then you've been distracted and gone off and done something completely else. Yeah. So I think it's a perfect analogy for that.
Anyway, back to McLaren, as of course this is a McLaren podcast, and not a team full of I suppose carbon. There is a good healthy dose of colour on it. A bit of a different launch this year because obviously we saw the livery sometime mid-Jan, and then we saw the actual car. Well, I say actual car; it's launch season, so guaranteed they're not going to be very similar to what we've seen in Bahrain next week. So the MCA 38 comes out. It doesn't look hugely dramatic compared to what we've seen. I mean, I'm thinking obviously the Red Bull car that came out looked hugely different. Matt, what did you make of their launch? Because it was a very muted one compared to sort of what we had last year when they had a big show at the MTC. This was pretty much a case of here's the car, here's the lot. It's going to be tested this afternoon.
Yeah, I feel like they just really staggered all the launches they actually had. So, because what's weird about it, because normally you expect to see the teams who are towards the back of the grid do their launches first, get the most press out of it. And then the first case we normally see is with a Haas team. They're normally ones to put up their renders because they literally don't have the finances to do anything else. So therefore, they want to be the first team out there. But it was actually kind of McLaren, I think, who beat them to the punch with it. And it was really early on. And yeah, obviously it was mock-up renders. And then we saw the first glimpse of the new driver race suits when they were in Barcelona. I think it's when Oscar was just getting back into the rhythm of things of driving around in the 2022 car. But that's how they chose to reveal the new driver suits. Mm-hmm. And then we had then they were coming up to their Silverstone test day. So it kind of felt like it was not like an afterthought, but it kind of seemed like, okay, we've got to release our actual version now, which is counterintuitive because it wasn't in real life. So they were just putting out more images before then doing the actual Silverstone test. It just felt for me like they had almost two big sort of launches, which weren't big launches, as like you said, as opposed to last year when they had a whole live stream. You had Vicstar presenting everything, and you had a whole crowd there, a load of influencers and press and what have you. Whereas I feel like the common theme, apart from the bigger teams this year, is very much being just quickly announce it, just no fluff, just get into what everyone's kind of here is to see the car. And yeah, and also that's one thing that did annoy me in the actual first launch film for it, because they were obviously showing off that they've got a brand new wind tunnel. It's now up and operational in Woking, which that in itself has been in the works with the local not local government, or the county council there, because it's obviously using energy and stuff so much. So it's been a huge project for them to actually work it. So I love the inclusion of that in the film. But then it kind of teased us because then it had the normal carbon fiber car in it. Then it went to all papaya orange, which is a classic old school McLaren when even back when Fernando was driving it. And for a brief moment, all of us were like, oh, they're bringing it back. And then it changed, and you were like, no. I mean, I do like the livery, but yeah, I don't know what you guys felt about it. I just felt like the releases this year just didn't feel as impactful.
Yeah, what do you reckon, Sam? Do you reckon there's an ulterior motive behind it, or are we reading too much into the muted sort of way of releasing something?
I don't know. It's certainly an interesting PR strategy, because obviously back in January, all of a sudden they released the livery around the same time as that whole kind of whatever it takes. Have you ever been counted out before you've even begun video? And Sam, I know you have some views on that.
I forgot about that. Yeah,
exactly. It was like, you know what, we're gonna get in first. We're gonna run the table from a PR perspective. We are gonna own the news cycle for 2 weeks until the next car is revealed. And that is realistically, most people care probably more about the livery than they do all the little technical details, especially in an era of renders and very clever lighting, so you can't see all the kind of details and the specifics of the car at launch. And I think that was very clever, and it almost was like they were trying to bake in this kind of fatigue that by the time that it got to the actual launch and there were press there and Stella and the drivers had to talk, that people were kind of a little bit like, oh, I'm done with the McLaren. They also got incredibly fortunate that they were launching on the same day as the Mercedes, and obviously everyone was like, oh, Mercedes, what are they going to say? How long will it be before they address Lewis and Ferrari? So I think they got lucky in some ways there, but it almost feels like they wanted to ramp it up and then kind of really fall into the background as the season's beginning, almost to subvert expectations almost. So I mean, it's certainly a departure.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair point. I mean, like you said, I think going into the end of last season, I think a lot of people, and I was one of these, would say that they were the second best team on the grid. They were constantly challenging Red Bull. So you're right. It could be entirely we want to sort of set expectations low and not have people think we're going to be flying out of the traps. I mean, even comparing to Mercedes, like you said, they both launched on the same day. They both had short runs in Silverstone. And if you compare the images we saw of the W15 to the MCL38, like there's so many more clips and images of that going around. Like you've seen so much more of that car. And maybe, yes, of course, that might be to do with the fact that Mercedes need to show they've changed something because they've had sort of quite a few bad years. They promised these big design changes. But yeah, obviously launch season in itself is quite a weird thing because, like you said, there's a lot of rendered images, and I think even the McLaren ones we saw, they've been rendered different angles, look different ways. I mean, Matt, how similar do you think this car we saw go around Silverstone, how similar is that going to be to pre-season testing and then the first race itself?
Oh, I think it's going to be completely different. I think like obviously with like McLaren and Mercedes, I mean, the main reason why they kind of launched in the same day, ultimately it's just because it's the first time they were going to hit the track at Silverstone. You're going to have people nearby who are going to be taking photos and stuff. I mean, now we've got like the lovely Hilton Hotel right next to the circuit, like literally on it. You can hire out a balcony, have a camera there, and you can get the perfect shots if you wanted to see everything. So I feel like maybe even like hopefully in the future there's like a when they're talking about the budget caps, maybe they can like exclude that for when you're doing your test days. There isn't a budget because obviously they're sharing a track because to hire Silverstone for the day is obviously very expensive, but then you have these issues of where they're launching on the same days. But I think the car is going to be a lot different to what we see in Bahrain. I think they'll obviously for the first day will probably run the same setup that they tried to do in Silverstone, but obviously it was a complete washout. I mean, why people want to try and do like testing at this time of the year at Silverstone? Of course, it's just not going to be practical in any way because you're not going to learn about any new improvements or anything. It's just literally to get video footage and like with like onboard cameras and stuff. But yeah, I reckon like they'll have like a good 2 different genesises of the car to utilize obviously both Lando and Oscar to like see, okay, here's what we currently worked on at the moment, and now here's the version 2 based off what we're looking at the other teams and what they've shown out. I mean, obviously Mercedes and Red Bull have done a few different tweaks, especially with their side pod. It looks like Mercedes have now brought in the side pod, whereas Red Bull have done more of a vertical one. And so in between this time now, I'm pretty sure we'll see like here's what we've copied version, but here's our original Genesis potentially.
Yeah, you're right. It's very much a show and tell portion of the year where teams don't want to show too much because they're aware that things can be copied very quickly. I think one of the interesting things that Andrea Stella said was compare this to last year where they went into the season massively behind schedule. I think Lando Norris was very downbeat on sort of what early season chances were. We saw that. I mean, how terrible were they in Bahrain last year? This year, he said whenever that press conference was that it's going to be on time. Like, yes, there might be some development projects that take a little bit longer, but the car's going to hit the track running. Sam, how important do you think that is going to be to McLaren achieving their objectives for this year?
I think it's central to it. I think last year, and I really admired the way they came out last year and didn't try and kind of beat around the bush. They're like, look, we missed the mark and it's going to take some time to catch up. This year, there are some subtle differences when Andrea Stella says that not all the areas we want to address have been addressed yet. It's very much we are on the right path. We are seeing that we're not seeing the diminishing returns that we did with previous concepts. So there is a lot of length left in this. So I think it's absolutely critical that they are in that place because they are building from where they were at the end of last year as opposed to this time 12 months ago. They were unwinding mistakes that were made months before that and then having to redevelop through that. So yeah, they're from an entirely different place and there's no reason why they're not fighting immediately with the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of what sort of the car looks like, I mean, we all sort of agreed before the podcast started recording, we're not hugely technical people. So don't come to us expecting in-depth aero analysis or whatever. But in general, like we've sort of seen a lot of the cars begin to look a lot, I'm going to say a lot like Red Bull, but obviously not this year's Red Bull. Like there's definitely been a convergence. Would you agree, Matt, of sort of common designs that we're going to see across the grid?
Yeah, I think so. I think most of the biggest changes we've seen with all the car launches this year has been the side pods and like there's been a lot of talk about the underbite and overbite, which is obviously the where the air intake comes in. If it's got more of a swoop going into the engine cover, or if it's more like just hoping the natural airflow will work on that. But then we've seen like Red Bull came out with like, it's got shoulders now. That's a thing that cars have. It's like just to help with airflow. And then we've seen the radical design with Mercedes' front wing, which normally when you see, so for those who don't know, with the front wing, effectively in the rule book, you need to have at least sort of 3 sort of steps in your front wing. And Mercedes are experimenting to skirt around that rule by having one of their top sort of steps being ultra thin. So technically it's still there. But I always see that as kind of like, if they know the package isn't that good, what's a really radical change that we can try to do to perform with it? With that being like last year, without running side pods again, didn't work in their favor. So they're now going to this one and now brought back side pods. And it seems with McLaren, it seems like, yeah, they are doing it more. It's not properly copying what Red Bull were doing before. They're gone down their own strategy where the air intake box is very square, very just straight on mechanical, whereas everyone's are more flowing with the car. But then again, like I'm really curious to see, like when we do go to Bahrain, is it going to be the exact same? And we can sort of touch on this as well. There's obviously been some news about like Photoshop magic and like hiding the floor, making it look with generative AI, making it look much more simplified. Whereas you got one angle from the front looking a certain way, but on the side it looked completely different. But then it's sort of like, even going back to the whole carbon fiber debate, you know, like how much of that is really going to make a difference? Like if we were to fully paint an F1 car or completely remove the carbon fiber, are you actually logically going to gain a couple tenths per lap? Probably not. Or that's why you get to go testing.
Yeah, you're right. Like, and you bring up a good point. Like, I think it was motorsport.com who sort of spotted it first, that images of the floor look different depending on where you see it. And I think most of the time when you see a car during a launch, it is a render of it. Like teams are showing you what they want to show. Like we had a good example of Red Bulls. Like other than the pictures of the car on the screen, like it was very hard to see their side point kind of thing. So yeah, like you said, it's not till Bahrain till we sort of get that first test. And sort of on the topic of testing, I mean, it's something that Zach Brown brings up a lot. Like, I'll pass this to you, Sam. Do you think teams should be allowed more chances to test? Like, Zach Brown's sort of solution to this is we've got a cost cap now. Teams should be able to spend whatever they want to do with their cost cap. Why is it so restricted? I mean, I always use this analogy that imagine you've got a tennis player who's not allowed to pick up the racket until like one day a week. Like, it seems quite backwards. Would you agree that teams have such limited testing?
It absolutely is. And you take, say, a bit of a side point, the criticism of Logan Sargent last season. This is a driver who went F3, F2, straight into F1, limited testing. For rookies to be able to adapt to that environment, it's incredibly difficult. And obviously that's, as I said, a slight side point. But it's so different from, say, when Fernando Alonso came into the sport, when he had years of testing before he even made his debut. So it's increasingly difficult for teams to actually know where they stand. Even Fernando Alonso himself is saying, actually, I feel like, why not have 2 cars? Why do we have to have 1 car at testing? That seems ridiculous that I'm sitting around waiting for Lance to get out of the car for half a day. And yeah, Zach Brown's right that why shouldn't they be able to spend that money where they need to, within restrictions, obviously. But you could have mandated or longer test sessions that are mandated by F1. You don't have to reintroduce private testing. You can just have more public testing. And I think it would ultimately even the playing field out, because you do over time converge, unless you're constantly following Red Bull, who will then throw in a few misdirects. And what if the engine cover concept, they've just like, you know what, we'll just make one. We're not going to have this in Bahrain, but we're going to make everyone spend 2 weeks going, oh wait, maybe there was something in that idea. So yeah, I think it gives the teams more opportunity to learn more and therefore converge, which is ultimately key in a cost cap era when you have limited scope to catch up.
Yes, Red Bull do love a sandbag. I mean, Matt, so why do you think F1/FIA, why do you think they have limited testing so much? Is it, I mean, this is something that gets thrown at the sport a bit, like they're trying to create that manufactured, I don't know, like drama and sort of make it a bit harder to produce a perfect race weekend. Do you think that's a possible reason behind this?
I think so. I think obviously those rules were put into place before we even had a cost cap, and so it makes sense by that point, because obviously when you go back to, I don't know, like to 2018 or 2019 or whatever, it like the competition was so close, but you did have the front runners there, and so that's where you just see the full force of like, okay, if you just got endless amounts of budget, how are you utilizing it? And then they had to put in some form of gatekeeping to be like, right, you can only do certain amounts of kilometers for a test day. You do also get granted a filming day as well, where you have a limited amount of laps to do stuff. But now we've got the cost cap in. I do really agree with Zach Brown. It's kind of like, well, you do need to have some limitations of kind of what you can do to the car, but ultimately, if you are being schooled of how much money you can spend it, then it's really up to the teams of like what you do with it. Then if you were Haas, for example, having like 4 extra test days could be so beneficial, because then you're not having to worry about wind tunnel testing as well, because obviously you get more allocation for the smaller teams. But ultimately, like, if you got your own money, then yeah, you don't need to fork out on like VIP catering for your Red Bull or something. You can properly put it into the car, and then your car can do all of its performance on the track. So when you do come to Bahrain, that could be such a heightened workflow, because loads of teams obviously spend their budgets how they want to, but they can't do that with the car, which seems really counterintuitive. So yeah, if we are having a cost cap, then yeah, I feel like you do need to let up some of the regulations, even like I say, potentially with the car, you know, like if you're putting all the finances into building a really powerful machine, then yeah, let them have it basically.
Yeah, I mean, 100% agree with you. I think we would get a lot more interesting looking cars if teams could try something. Because at the moment, like, the opportunity to experiment is so risk more than reward. Like, if you experiment and get it wrong, as we saw with Mercedes, the perfect example, they thought this was going to work. They would have been able to see it wasn't going to work if they had more time to testing, and ultimately you're getting cars that look quite similar. During the launch, we obviously heard from a lot of the big players, obviously the drivers, team principals, Zach Brown, etc. We didn't hear from the likes of Rob Marshall and Dave Sanchez. I mean, it's understandable. They're technology chiefs; they're not going to come in. But I did want to ask you to. I'll start with you, Sam. Sort of, when are we going to see the impact of these guys come in? Because obviously, the way that F1 contracts work, I mean, they were announced sort of early last year, mid last year, but they didn't start work until the start of 2024 due to the gardening leave they have. When do you think we'll start to see their input on the car?
In terms of their specific input themselves, I think, probably the start of the European season, when you start to see those first developments and upgrades kind of trickling through onto the cars. But I think more interestingly, I think we're already seeing the impact of that Trident approach or structure in place, the philosophy that McLaren have employed, because they're allowing so much more technical freedom for those various departments, the ones that Sanchez, Marshall are heading up. So they are empowered to take their remit in their own direction. And I think it will potentially become the standard bearer as to how teams operate moving forward.
Do you agree with that? Do you think this is something that we're going to see all the teams doing? Or do you think, obviously, McLaren aren't one of the poorer teams, like they might have the budget for this? Or do you think this is something that you could see the whole grid doing one day?
Yeah, I think like, because at the moment we do see that a lot with like musical chairs and such. And I think I was really excited when I was see like, yeah, Bob Marshall sort of like moving across, because obviously he's so renowned. Obviously, you know, you got the win with like with Renault, and then he's been going up through Red Bull and has his internal promotions there. And I think like, obviously there's a big conversation like, oh, everything is around behind Adrian Newey designing the F1 car, and I feel like it's really unfair, because it's like there's such a big team behind that, and ultimately, yes, you do have a guy who's drawing out some concepts and it makes it work, but he's not directly responsible for all of the team success. And so when you do have these really powerful team members behind you who they can see a car as a certain way, or they're wanting to maybe implement their own ideas and they're not necessarily getting it. Because obviously, if you look at their example, like they're going to get paid high salaries with Red Bull. They're constantly winning every sort of race and getting decent championships. But then if that for you as an employee, that's still not giving you dissatisfaction and not being like, okay, well, that's not my win. That's like a teammate's or a co-worker's sort of thing. They're wanting to really excel that even further. So I think we're going to start to see their effects probably by like sort of mid this year, especially now they've got the wind tunnel as well. And that's where they can really just jump into it. Like you said, they have had a lot of time off due to gardening leave, which is completely understandable. So they're not able to see what Red Bull have been cooking for the last few months. But I think it's I think McLaren are going to be in a really, really good position. Obviously, we had a change of management at the beginning of last year, and it seems like Zach has really now just nailed in of like fully kind of controlling the team and now getting some really good sort of like performance members in there to like really move it forward. And like with having two drivers with Lando and Oscar, who arguably are like one of the best driver pairings that the grid of the whole entire Formula One grid we've seen. I reckon in like next 2 years, they're easily going to be top level.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. If we look across the grid, like I think only McLaren really, you'd say, are a team that haven't lost staff members. Like even Red Bull, like you said, have gone. Mercedes have had a bit of an exodus last year, and even someone like Laurent Mekies, who's left Ferrari, like you said, to sort of have his own success at another team. Like if we move on to the drivers a little bit, I mean, you brought them up there. Like obviously, this car launch, we sort of know the drivers already. Like they don't need to be launched. Both going to their second. Piastri going to his second season. Sam, if we can talk about him for a little bit, like what do you think is like a realistic expectation for him this year? Is he ready to fight Lando, or is it still another learning year, you reckon?
I think he is ready to fight Lando. Maybe not consistently week in, week out, but certainly at points. I think he needs to look at it as a learning year. The sophomore slump isn't so much a thing in F1 because it is you and machine. It's not like, in say football or basketball where opposition can learn how you play, how you operate. So it's not so much an issue for Oscar in that sense. But I think it would be unwise to allow the Qatar sprint win to place undue expectation on him. And that's not just from himself, but from everyone else in the media, fans, so on and so forth. Because yes, he got a win before Lando, kind of technically, not technically, whatever however you want to look at it. But I think he just needs to do what he was doing last year on a more consistent basis, and that will close the gap naturally to Lando.
Drivers are always hesitant to say what position they sort of deem as success, but Sam, just going off the back of that, what come this time next year or at the end of the season, what position would you say that Oscar, if he finished there, Oscar's had a good year? Like whereabouts in the grid do you reckon?
6th or 7th, I'd say he's had a good year. I think for Lando, 3rd. I think he'll be looking at. I think he'll want to be best of the rest. But for Oscar, I think he will want to be in there with the other second drivers.
We'll move on to Lando then, Matt, because obviously you spend a fair bit of time with him. Do you say P3 is enough for him, or do you think he's sort of got that eye on P2? I mean, from my perspective, obviously Verstappen seems to be the clear and obvious choice for sort of number one. Do you think Lando's as good as the others to sort of get that P2 spot?
P2, that's what's going to happen there is Ricciardo will replace Sergio Perez and will easily slap up P2 there. That's what's going to happen. There's no bias here whatsoever.
So I'm just putting my bet on now. So.
Don't worry, Lando knows he's my favourite. They're both my favourites. I think P3 is what Lando will be aiming for. Ultimately, he's always going to be wanting to try and get the McLaren team to winning the championship. And I think that's where we're not going to see it as a competitive edge between him and Oscar. I think there it's really not a Lewis versus Nico Rosberg situation. It's very much like neither of us don't matter here. It's just getting the McLaren back to the top of the grid, and like we haven't seen that kind of resurgence from another team in quite a while. I mean, we've seen like teams starting to fall back now. You've had Williams, who had loads of success, have now fallen off a bit. You had Haas, who arguably started off really good, has now fallen off. You've got Mercedes, done amazing, has now started to fall off, and we haven't seen a resurgence from another team in a little while. I mean, even with Ferrari, we can even say as well. But yeah, I would also agree with Sam that a P6 for Oscar I think is very much achievable. Even P5, I would actually say. It would also come down to the car. I think what Lando and Oscar do really well is that they get everything they can out of it, but unlike other drivers, maybe like we can use like Charles Leclerc as an example, where he's overdriving so much that he pushes the limits and then unfortunately has like accidents or incidents because he's just trying to get the most out of it but going too far. I think Lando and Oscar both showcase that in Silverstone, where on their day they capitalized as much as they could given the circumstances, and and got a great result for the team. And like the turnaround they had, as you mentioned before, Sam, at the beginning of the season, being at the very bottom in last in Bahrain after having already a difficult year the year prior, and then being turning it around to Lando Norris got another podium as a consistent thing is such an unheard thing. So I think both of them are just going to try to utilize the car as much as they can. And if it is a continuation from last year, then I think we should be really confident it'll be P3 and hopefully P5.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to sort of the team as a whole, really. I was going to bring this up later, but we can chat about it now. I think we're all pretty much agreed, or don't want to agree maybe, but I think we all secretly agree. Red Bull, obviously, clear favourite for P1. I mean, unless this car is an absolute nightmare, and then we'll see. But presuming the Red Bull sort of go to the P1 again, who are you backing as sort of that P2 spot? I mean, obviously, we've had all the launches now. We've had a very different design from Mercedes. We've had Ferrari look quite good as well. And then obviously, I think you sort of throw McLaren in that bunch as well. Sam, for you, who are you sort of backing for that P2 spot? I know it's early. I appreciate we've had very minimal laps. I'm sort of putting you on the spot right now, but that's what you're here for. That's why you're here for these hot takes.
I would like to see it being McLaren. I think it could well be McLaren. I think they would say that that's not what they're aiming for. I think that's maybe they obviously playing the PR game there. But there is a really great opportunity for them this year to capitalise on a Carlos Sainz that is leaving Ferrari and a team that's gearing up for Lewis Hamilton. And then on the other hand, you've got a Mercedes who are losing Lewis Hamilton, which will undoubtedly unsettle the team. Internally, they'll be looking, going, do we need to go into a bit of a rebuild? Do we need a couple of years where we're consolidating on various other factors and not necessarily fighting as up at the front as we have done over the last decade? So that, I think, gives an opportunity for McLaren to kind of nestle in there with the consistency and the stability that they have from last year to this year. So yeah, I think P2 is well within their reach, and I think there's no real reason why they can't get P2.
I mean, yeah, he brings up a good point, doesn't Matt? Like, if you look around the grid, I mean, obviously, you've got Ferrari's got a driver going out, you've got Mercedes got a driver going out. I mean, it's not a situation we're unfamiliar with. Like, we've even had a McLaren, of course, when Sainz went to Ferrari. But in that case, there was a lot of goodwill behind it, wasn't there? Do you think the fact that Sainz has essentially been shown the door, a very unceremonious exit, like the press release didn't even mention him, even in the press, the media stuff he did this week, it was very much, you get in one question, that's it, we're not talking about it kind of thing. Is that going to be enough to disrupt, I mean, potentially both teams, both Mercedes and Ferrari?
I feel like the way Carlos Sainz is going to be leaving is that classic like Homer Simpson clip of him going through the grass and he's got middle fingers both smiling and what have you. I think he's going to be like, no, I'm the better driver. Here's what I've got. I mean, like last season, obviously quickly just comparing him to like Leclerc, he was like more consistent, and I would argue to say he was a better driver. And so to have this news come out, I think he's going to show his worth more than he did like last season. And I mean, we always have this big promise, because we're all secretly also F1 Ferrari fans as well, that we all hope that we can see the return of the Ferrari. We've seen a bit of a different change with the car in terms of like we were talking about before with the side pods, but I mean, until we see like the first race, we're not going to be too sure how competitive it's going to actually be. I don't reckon I think P3 I think it's going to just be between Mercedes and Ferrari to see who's going to get P3 in the championship. I think P2 is very secure for McLaren if like they have no reliability issues and there's hopefully no in-team fighting, but I can't see that happening at all. Yeah, I think it's a lot of us trusting and willing that these teams are hopefully going to do well again, but we haven't seen anything, I would say, that is like it's like they found a new discovery that's going to push them straight up to the top of the field. I mean, like if Red Bull are dramatically changing how their engine covers are looking and their air intakes, but everyone else is now just adapted to almost what they were doing last season, it kind of seems like most teams are still on the back foot, whereas Red Bull have absolutely sold it going forward.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it does seem like they're sort of decorating the icing while everyone's sort of still making the cake. And again, good point about Ferrari, because obviously this is the same week where we've had that video come out. Obviously, Matt, I saw your edit. I mean, that was obviously taken on the chin by the Ferrari team, sort of putting out their own version. But I will no longer bother you with speculation. Like, let's talk about some stuff that we're not waiting to see the cars on track. I mean, Zach Brown gave an interview to Sky Sports when they were at the Silverstone test. I mean, Zach Brown's obviously a guy who's very happy to sort of speak his mind and bring up opinions. This isn't a new opinion that we've heard before. He was particularly talking about A and B teams, and obviously he didn't mention them, but there's only one company that has two teams on the grid. Obviously, that's Red Bull with, I mean, it's going to be hard to describe them this year, isn't it? Red Bull and then the RBs, I think everyone's sort of decided on. The second team, the Italy-based team, as we'll call them. Like, he's very much of the mind that it's not fair in a sporting sense to have two teams. And I mean, just some of the context, obviously, like they were bought out at the same time. They took over Minardi. Like they've been on the grid for years, but now it's sort of becoming under the spotlight a bit more now that other entities can't really get on the grid. I mean, Sam, do you think he's got a point? Do you think, I mean, also what can the FIA do about this? Because at the end of the day, like, it's a privately owned company. It's going to be very hard for someone like the FIA to say that has to win.
I think he absolutely has a point. I think it's long been an issue. It's not just isolated to Red Bull and RB. Haas still operate partly out of Maranello. So there are teams up and down the grid that have closer relationships to other teams than they perhaps should. It's very difficult for F1 to police that, as we know. I think what I find particularly interesting is that everything that's coming out of Visa Cash App RB this preseason is that, we're not just, we're not a B team anymore. We're our own team. Well, simultaneously taking as many components as they possibly can for the first time in a long time from the main team. So that's a real contradiction there. Like, what are you? Like, are you their second team or are you independent? Because if you're independent, you wouldn't be taking all those components. So it is a problem. I think the fact that the contracts are held centrally for the drivers as well. I mean, Matt, you've already touched upon a potential mid-season replacement, but we've seen time and time again from Red Bull. That in itself, no other team has the ability to operate in that way, or at least do so without a cost. So there is an unfair advantage. Zach Brown is absolutely right. F1, and I don't know what the solution is, but F1 would need to find some innovative ways of dealing with that problem before it gets out of hand.
Yeah, I would definitely say as well, like when they first acquired Minardi back then, it wasn't. I think what's the issues happen is because they purchased it back then and then try to establish it as its own team, and then since then the finances and the actual revenue that's coming from the teams has just grown so bigger. It's now grown into this problem rather than it from the get-go being, this is straight away our B second team. But it was a good scapegoat and not revenue source, but like program to put all of their drivers that they have signed to have some form of good path to go into, and like you do kind of have some other sort of, like, the only other example of a sort of sister team that we have is that with Haas with Ferrari. But I mean, like, straight away, if they're already saying that like the car is not going to be formed that good, it doesn't mean that the parts they've got from Ferrari are going to help them out in any way. I'm not. It's a hard one because there isn't like a clear solution to kind of fix it, because we can't just be like, well, you got to stop operating because you've got to do that. But I think there needs to be some, like, you have to operate in your own way. You can't share parts. You can't share like intellectual property of like whatever you've designed. It has to be isolated. But then it goes into the murky waters of like, okay, well, then we've got our manufacturers and then our customer teams of like who's building these engine parts. Because then even then McLaren could go into their own issue of like, well, technically the engine's not ours. It's from Mercedes. Because then it's like, well, then how far does it go? Because in theory, then you could say, well, Red Bull could argue saying, well, McLaren is a customer of Mercedes, so if like Alex Albon never wanted to jump into a McLaren, it wouldn't be the biggest leap in the world, but there is some form of connection there. So yeah, I'm not too sure what the best way for doing it. I mean, ultimately, if they were to lose a team, get Andretti straight in there. I mean, like having an actual manufacturer in would sort the solution out. But I mean, we've got to wait another 2 more years to see if that's going to be a reality.
Sam, what do you think the motivation behind this for Zach Brown is? Like, is it a case of he sort of wants the best for the sport, he's a fan for the sport, or, I mean, realistically, we can't see that RB is going to challenge McLaren like that high up the grid, but we've also got to take into account, obviously, every time they have an F1 commission meeting, any vote is pretty much decided before it's gone. It's always going to be they're going to vote the same. Do you think that's sort of the main motive behind why he's bringing this up?
It's got to be. I was going to say immediately. It's got to be voting blocks, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
political because there's only 10 teams and 2 teams voting in a always the same way. Immediately that reduces. There's 8 other teams or 7 teams and yourself, because you can count those 2 teams to vote in the same way, and it immediately reduces the numbers to the point where if you want it to go a certain way, you're already having to lobby other teams, so on and so forth. And that is increasingly going to become an issue for McLaren as they ascend up the grid. When you're fighting in the midfield or towards the back of the grid, it's less important in some ways. But Zach's will be looking ahead and saying, how can we carve out this space for ourselves and solidify those gains that we've made? And I think he'll look at that and say, they've got a second team, we don't. We're always going to struggle politically against a team like that. So I think it's both in the interest of the sport, but also it is in McLaren's interest. I think it's not one or the other. It's both simultaneously.
And Matt, what would you say? Because obviously, yes, they don't have another F1 team, but McLaren as an entity, a race in a lot of series, like of any team on the F1 grid, like they're doing the most. They're doing IndyCar, they're doing all that kind of stuff, and that does allow them to have quite a big pool of drivers. Do you think that's a fair argument to weigh at Zach Brown and say, yes, well, you've got people like Pato O'Ward who can come in and do a test kind of thing because he's happy in IndyCar?
Yeah, I think that's where I think McLaren have done it really, really well. Where like in all forms of like kind of motorsport they're involved with, and they're doing really well. Like you mentioned, you've got the IndyCar, you've got Extreme E, you've got Formula E, which is really on the rise as well. And yeah, they've got this great pool of drivers, and then obviously goes into the bigger issue of like super license points. Of like IndyCar drivers, like if they're winning the championship, don't even probably have enough to actually do a race in Formula One, which is madness. But they do everything by the book and like are being respectful for the drivers to still give them those opportunities. Whereas it seems like with Formula One on the other side, it's not being able to do that, or is in no rush to do that. And I think, when Zach does come out with these comments on interviews, he is very much saying it in a way to make it like for normal folk who don't understand the whole voting systems of the FIA and team logistics, to make it understandable, so then you do get the public agreement with you being like, yeah, actually when you say it like that doesn't make much sense. You've got a huge team where, let's say, because of the budget cap, so many of McLaren internal employees, rather than being like laid off or moved to a different company, they had to work on other motorsports. So like a lot of the old McLaren team had to then move to the Formula E sector or to the Extreme E one, so they're still involved in racing somehow, and that's how they managed to work it. Whereas like someone where like Mercedes, Red Bull had to make people redundant because they just, or that's all they had really. So I think when Zach Brown's coming up with these sort of statements, I'm very much in support of it, because he's like, yeah, we've been there and done it, and we're managing to work with it. But these other teams seem like they completely can get away with it, or like I mentioned before, doing driver transfers really easily within Formula One grid. But yeah, if they've got these great, like you mentioned there, like Alex being an incredible driver, yeah, give him a go in an F1 test, but it won't allow it because the voting blocks still not there for him.
Also, not for nothing on the driver point, Red Bull have a history of moving the drivers around. McLaren don't, actually, to the point that McLaren drivers in other series have openly mocked the suggestions that they are favourable in the line of getting a McLaren seat. I think it was Pato O'Ward kind of was like, it's basically just a carrot dangled in front of us. Like it's, and like they've openly mocked the whole kind of idea of that. Partly in the direction of Zach Brown, but partly in the direction of there's no favoritism here. We still have to earn our opportunities, which they do. They have free practice sessions, and but there hasn't been a case yet where an IndyCar drive has all of a sudden been helicoptered in halfway through a season to take over from Lando or Oscar. So until that happens, it's kind of hard to taint them with the same brush, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's the very, very fair point. Moving on to another driver. I mean, this is something else that Zach Brown said during his interview, that Hamilton's big move had no impact on Norris's contract. I mean, that's understandable. Like, we all know that these contracts aren't done in a day. Like he's been obviously been negotiating for months and months and months, so this wouldn't have had an impact. But obviously that Mercedes, I mean, like you said, it's a carrot dangling for someone. Like, Matt, in your mind, who are you sort of picking for that miss? I know, I appreciate, again, we're a year out, I'm sort of dropping this on you. Who do you think's got the best chance of getting that Mercedes spot next year?
Oh, it's easily going to be Alex Albon. Easily going to be Alex Albon. Like, it's not going to be that. I don't know the kid's name from. I think he's in F2 at the moment, but everyone's been talking about him, and it's like, what? That would make no sense for someone that young with, like we mentioned before, with very limited F1 actual track time to then go to like almost top level mid team. Just doesn't make any sense. You would have to have someone within the grid. Maybe do a swap around, or even maybe by that point, if Red Bull still haven't put Logan Sargent. Who am I thinking of? Liam Lawson.
Big shout!
Not Logan Sargent. I meant Liam
big
Lawson.
Shout, Logan Sargent for Red Bull spot.
No, definitely not. No. So if like say Liam Lawson hasn't been even moved up to RB or even to the main team, then maybe that's even a shout. But I think realistically it would be Albon. Which I think is going to be a really great driver pairing. You know, obviously Alex and George have been karting together and been going up the ranks all from since they were little kids. And then it might even see, their friendship not do as well because obviously George is thinking, oh, well, I'm going to be number one now, definitely confirmed. And then with the resurgence that, Albon's had, Albon can come into the Mercedes team being like, well, George, you got 1 point for Williams. I've got more than that. And so now you can sort of see the comparison. But that would be my sort of clear and obvious kind of pick for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great shout. I mean, obviously, Albon's sort of one of those drivers that, like you said, are very established. We've got this weird situation where a lot of these established drivers are on huge contracts. Like Norris is signed for a multi-year deal, Piastri signed for a lot of years, Leclerc signed for a lot of years. Like Max, obviously, is sort of untouchable. Really, like there's definitely it's not an abundance choice. So I can see why Albon is definitely higher there. You mentioned him, the young kid in F2, and I know Sam sort of really focused on F2. I mean, Antonelli coming up. Sort of the prodigal son really coming into F2. I mean, just touching on him briefly, how do you think he's going to sort of do this year? And is it too big a step up for you, Muriel?
I think there's every chance he'll do very well. What we're hearing so far is very positive. Someone coming into F2 and immediately excelling isn't unusual. We've had one season champions, Leclerc, Piastri, and they're clearly pretty good. That's not out the realms of possibility. However, he has skipped Formula 3. And I think that is maybe going unnoticed by some when they're talking about his prospects. He has a steeper learning curve than others moving into F2. And he's also up against Ollie Behrman, who is, an F1 driver in waiting, realistically, from what we've seen of him in free practice sessions and how quickly he's moved up the ladder as well. So it's going to be a very difficult environment. Also, it's a new F2 car. So, are Prema going to be as strong as they were last year? It's very difficult to tell. But moving back onto the kind of Mercedes point of it all, I think they hold the keys to the whole driver market now. I think they can actually cause a bit of a bottleneck or a stagnation because if they do want to assess Antonelli, they're going to want 4, 5, 6 rounds of the F2 season, which is going to take you well into the summer. So that could slow down the whole market from this point. Also, I'm very keen on Albon as well. Absolutely with you, Matt. But I think the outlier here is potentially Fernando Alonso. Does he fancy himself?
Oh my God, that would be so good. That would be so good.
It'd be amazing. But he's been very clever in interviews in the last few weeks of being like, no, I'm committed to the Aston Martin project. But I am the only world champion who hasn't got a contract for next year. He knows how high his stock is. He's well aware that he is the best option out there, realistically. And he's continuing to defy time. So I can't see why they wouldn't at least have a conversation about it.
Yeah, but he likes to stir the pot, though. I mean, like we got to remember, at some point last year, we were all convinced he was dating Taylor Swift, and that wasn't true, was it? But no, I think that's a really good shout. Though.
You watch when Fernando Alonso lines up at tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs next year.
So I think you mean Alpine co-owner. Please, that's his primary job role. Have some respect. Anyway, silly season. I'm sure.
What about you, Sam? Who do you think? Who do you think? Obviously, I've said Albon and other Samuel said. I said, what's yours, man?
Yeah, I'm honestly, I wrote an article sort of when it first came out, like listing the prospects, and I think it's impossibly hard. I mean, Albon is a good choice, but I mean, I'm going to choose Chaos. I think Alonso goes there. I could
Oh,
easily see it.
nice.
Like, yeah, easy see him go for a quick move. Provided, like, I mean, it's going to be very dependent. I mean, like you said, they're going to be waiting to see how Antonelli does, but at the same time, Alonso's going to be waiting to see how Mercedes does. Like, that car, he
Yeah.
wants to see is at least as quick as the Aston. And if it's not, there's no reason he's going to leave. But right now, if I had to put money on it, yeah, I'd put Alonso in there.
I mean,
Go,
I would
go
love
for
to
a bit of
see that.
chaos.
Yeah, you see Alonso go to Mercedes, you then see maybe Bottas move to Aston Martin, and then
I
you
reckon
see.
Tsunoda.
So,
I reckon that's convenient for the Honda thing.
Honda
I
Link,
think that
yeah.
could work out quite well.
Yeah, I just feel like I feel like the Honda thing. I feel like it's. I understand it. I get the link, but I just don't think his performance is. I mean, like he did okay, but there was still so many cracks in his pressure
Yeah,
from
that's
last year.
That's fair.
So I would very much see like if let's say that the Stake F1 team / Kick Sauber, it doesn't perform that well this year. I could see then Bottas potentially moving across and then having Teo Pourchaire come in and finally get like the seat that he rightfully I feel like deserves. Bless him. He's been on the wings. He needs to Felipe Drogovic. Like they need to give him a chance in. We haven't had a new F2 driver in for a while.
That's a very good point. I'm aware we're running quite long, so I'm going to ask them one word and one word only. Where is Carlos Sainz going to be next year? I'm going to start with you, Sam.
Steak.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Matt?
Kick.
There you go. Good branding. They're going to love that. Absolutely love that. Yeah, I think that's about all we got time for, really. Like, yeah, thanks again to both of you for joining me. I mean, it's been a fascinating week in the world of F1. As you can imagine, we're not going to touch the Christian Horner stuff of a barge pole, so just enjoy the stuff that we've seen so far. And yeah, thanks again to you two for both joining.
Thanks so much for having us, man.
Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it.
My thanks go to Matt and Sam for joining me today, and my thanks to you for listening along. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a release, and you can also follow us on socials at Pondering Papaya. But for now, thanks for listening and see you next week.